He owned the city. She scrubbed its diner tables. He was used to people shrinking in his presence, terrified of the whispers that followed him like a shadow. She was just too exhausted from a double shift to give a damn. When the most dangerous man in the room tested her with a single, twisted question, he expected fear. He expected a lie. What he got was the last thing he saw coming, and it changed both of their lives forever. Stick around for this one. The fluorescent lights in the Starlight Diner didn't just hum. They buzzed with a low, menacing frequency that felt like a drill against the skull by 2 a.m. Sadie pressed her weight against the edge of the Formica counter, digging her thumb into the base of her spine. Her lower back throbbed in time with the flickering neon sign outside. She was 28, working a job meant for a teenager, in a body that the world constantly reminded her took up too much space. Her apron strings bit into her waist, and her thighs chafed beneath the cheap polyester uniform. She didn't hate her body, but she hated how much it hurt after 14 hours on her feet. The diner smelled of burnt coffee, stale grease, and the sharp tang of ammonia. It was the scent of rock bottom. At this hour, the clientele usually consisted of drunk college kids trying to sober up before heading back to the dorms, or long-haul truckers whose eyes looked like shattered glass. Tonight, it was empty. Until the bell above the door chimed, Sadie didn't look up immediately. She kept her focus on the dried ring of syrup she was scraping off the counter with a metal spatula. "Take any booth," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "Coffee's fresh, but the pie is from yesterday. Don't say I didn't warn you." Silence. No shuffling feet, no drunken giggles. She dragged her gaze up from the counter. 4 men stood in the entryway. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. They didn't belong here. They were draped in dark, tailored wool coats that probably cost more than Sadie made in 2 years. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the ugly, checkered linoleum of the diner floor. 3 of the men were built like brick walls, broad shoulders, thick necks, eyes darting to the corners of the room, checking the exits, checking the kitchen swinging doors. But it was the man in the center who pulled the oxygen out of the room. He wasn't the biggest. He was lean, with a quiet, lethal stillness about him. His dark hair was swept back, and his jawline looked like it had been carved from marble and unforgiving choices. His eyes were entirely black, flat and unreadable. He didn't look at the exits. He looked at Sadie, Roman Falcone. Sadie didn't know his name, not yet, but she knew the type. She had lived in this city long enough to know when the apex predator walked into the enclosure. The air grew heavy, pressing against her eardrums. A normal person would have trembled. A normal person would have dropped the spatula and backed into the kitchen. Sadie was too tired to be normal. She had rent due in 3 days. Her car needed a new alternator, and she had a blister on her left heel the size of a quarter. She didn't have the emotional bandwidth for fear. She tossed the dirty rag into a plastic tub beneath the counter and grabbed a fresh notepad. "Booth in the back is the cleanest," Sadie said, her tone flat. She walked out from behind the counter, the thick rubber soles of her shoes squeaking against the floor. She grabbed 4 laminated menus that had seen better decades. The men didn't move until the quiet man in the center gave a microscopic nod. They filed past her. The scent of them, expensive cologne, cold night air, and something metallic that smelled suspiciously like gun oil, washed over her. They slid into the red vinyl booth. The quiet man sat on the outside, his back to the wall, giving him a clear view of the door and the kitchen. Sadie walked over, dropping the menus onto the table with a dull smack. "Coffee?" she asked, clicking her pen. One of the larger men, a guy with a broken nose and a silk tie, sneered. He looked Sadie up and down, his eyes lingering cruelly on the curve of her stomach and the fullness of her hips. "You got anything back there that isn't soaked in grease, sweetheart?" Sadie met his gaze, deadpan. "Napkins." The broken-nosed man bristled, his hand twitching toward the inside of his coat. "Listen here, you fat—" Sal. The word wasn't shouted. It was barely above a whisper, spoken by the quiet man. But it slammed into the table like a gavel. Sal froze, the color draining from his face. He swallowed hard and looked down at his hands. The quiet man turned his dark eyes back to Sadie. Up close, he looked exhausted. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, and the lines around his mouth suggested a man who spent his life carrying things too heavy to put down. "4 coffees. Black," he said. His voice was smooth, a low baritone that vibrated in Sadie's chest. "And whatever you recommend." "The meatloaf," Sadie said without missing a beat. "It's the only thing the cook didn't burn tonight, and it's heavy enough to soak up whatever you guys were drinking before you came here." The quiet man's lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was a break in the ice. 4 meatloafs, Sadie wrote it down, tore the ticket off, and turned on her heel. She didn't look back as she walked to the kitchen, feeling the heavy, prickling weight of his stare tracking her the entire way. 10 minutes later, Sadie balanced an oval tray carrying 4 massive plates of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and thick gravy. Her wrist ached under the weight, but her grip was steady. When she approached the booth, the conversation died instantly. It wasn't a natural lull. It was a violent cessation of sound. The men were leaning in, their faces tight with stress. Whatever they were discussing, it was ugly. Sadie began distributing the plates. She leaned over the table, her hip brushing against the edge. Sal, the guy who had insulted her earlier, pulled his arm back sharply, as if catching her disease. Sadie ignored him. She set the plates down with mechanical precision. As she reached over to place a fresh mug of coffee in front of the quiet man, his hand shot out. His fingers wrapped around her wrist. Sadie stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. His grip wasn't crushing, but it was immovable. The heat of his skin bled through the cheap fabric of her sleeve. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low. "Sadie," she said. She didn't try to pull away. Instinct told her that fighting a man like this would only make him tighten his grip. She looked him in the eye, keeping her chin level. "And unless you want this hot coffee in your lap, I suggest you let go of my arm." The 3 other men at the table tensed, sliding their hands beneath their jackets. The man stared at her. He searched her face, looking past the exhaustion, past the smudged eyeliner, probing for the fear that usually accompanied his presence. When he didn't find it, his thumb lightly brushed the inside of her wrist, right over her pulse point. It was beating steadily. He released her. "Sit down, Sadie," he said. "I have tables to wipe," she replied, stepping back. "The place is empty. Sit." It wasn't a request. It was an inevitability. Sadie hesitated, then grabbed a stray metal chair from an adjacent table. She pulled it over and sat down at the head of the booth, crossing her arms over her chest. "Clock is ticking. I get off in 20 minutes. The man leaned back in the vinyl booth, ignoring his food. He pulled a silver case from his inside pocket, extracting a cigarette. He lit it, taking a slow drag. The smoke curled into the yellowed diner ceiling. "I have a problem, Sadie," he said quietly. "I run a business, a very lucrative, very demanding business. Recently, I've noticed a discrepancy in the books. Someone is skimming off the top." Sadie raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a job for an accountant. I'm a waitress." "I don't trust accountants," he replied smoothly. "They only see numbers. They don't see people. Waitresses, on the other hand, waitresses see everything. You watch people eat. You watch them argue, celebrate, lie. You know when someone is carrying a secret just by the way they hold their fork." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded $100 bill. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "I want to ask you a question," he said. "If you answer it honestly, the money is yours." Sadie looked at the bill. $100 was a week of groceries. It was part of her heating bill. It was breathing room. She looked back up at him. "Ask." He gestured vaguely with his cigarette toward the three men sitting with him. Sal, a younger guy with slicked-back hair named Benny, and an older, grey-haired man who looked like he was carved from driftwood. "Look at my table," the boss said, his voice dropping to a register that only they could hear. "Tell me which one of them is stealing from me." The three men froze. The color drained from Benny's face. The older man gripped his fork so hard his knuckles turned white. Sal's eyes darted nervously toward the door. Sadie's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of sheer, unadulterated apathy. She realized in a sickening rush that this wasn't a game. The air in the diner had turned toxic. This man was a judge, and he was asking her to act as the jury. If she pointed a finger, someone might not make it to sunrise. She looked at the men, really looked at them. She noticed things. She had been observing them since they walked in. She survived the night shift by reading people, knowing who was going to dine and dash, who was going to get violent, who was going to tip well. "Well?" the boss prompted softly. Sadie uncrossed her arms and rested her hands on the table. "None of them," she said flatly. The boss tilted his head. "Are you sure? Take a closer look." "I don't need to," Sadie said. She pointed to Sal. "This guy is a bully, but he's a coward. He overcompensates by being loud and insulting women. A guy like that doesn't have the spine to steal from a man who terrifies him." Sal looked outraged, but the boss held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. Sadie pointed to Benny. "The kid is sweating through his expensive suit. He's terrified of his own shadow. He's been staring at the kitchen door like a SWAT team is going to burst through it. He's too paranoid to pull off a long con. If he stole a dime, he'd turn himself in out of pure anxiety." Finally, she looked at the older man. "And him. He hasn't looked at anything but his plate since I put it down. He's loyal. Or at least, he's resigned. He's tired. He just wants to eat his meatloaf and go home." The boss took another drag of his cigarette. "So you're saying I'm wrong? No one at this table is stealing from me." "Oh, someone is stealing from you," Sadie said, her voice steady. She looked the boss dead in his pitch-black eyes. "But he's not sitting at this table. He's the guy you left outside in the car." The diner went dead, silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The boss's eyes narrowed by a fraction of an inch. "Excuse me?" "When you walked in," Sadie explained, her voice remarkably calm for a woman who felt like she was standing on a trap door. "I saw 4 of you, but I saw a black sedan parked across the street. The engine is still running. The exhaust is blowing. There's a guy behind the wheel. You didn't bring him inside." "Why?" The boss didn't answer. "You brought these 3 in here to interrogate them," Sadie continued, leaning in just a fraction. "You suspected them. But the guy in the car, the driver, that's the guy you trust to watch your back. That's the guy you don't suspect. The one who has access to your schedules, your routes, your blind spots. You're looking for a rat in the trap, but the rat is the one holding the cage." The 3 men at the table stared at Sadie in stunned silence. The boss sat perfectly still. The cigarette burned down dangerously close to his fingers. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. Then Roman Falcone threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a harsh, barking laugh that tore out of his chest, startling his own men. He crushed the cigarette out in the aluminum ashtray on the table. "Elias," he said, looking at the older man. "Go outside. Relieve Tommy of his driving duties. Check the trunk of his car. If you find the duffel bag, handle it." The older man stood up instantly. Yes, boss. He walked out of the diner without another word. Roman looked back at Sadie. The coldness in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a burning, intense curiosity. He slid the $100 bill toward her. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick money clip, peeled off 4 more hundreds and placed them on top. "Keep the change," he said. Sadie looked at the money, then at him. "I didn't do it for the tip." "I know," Roman said softly. He stood up, towering over her. He buttoned his coat, his eyes never leaving her face. "You did it because you're the smartest person in the room, and you know it. Have a good night, Sadie." He turned and walked out, his men scrambling to follow him. Sadie sat in the chair for a long time, staring at the $500 on the table. Outside, tires screeched, and the dark sedan sped off into the night. She was shaking now. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. She swept the money into her apron pocket, carried the barely touched plates back to the kitchen, and locked the door. For 3 days, Sadie jumped at shadows. Every time the diner bell rang, her heart rate spiked. She expected men in dark suits to walk in and drag her out back. She had inserted herself into Mafia business. She had pointed a finger that likely ended a man's life. The $500 sat in an envelope in her underwear drawer, untouched, burning a hole in her conscience. But nothing happened. The diner remained a purgatory of spilled milkshakes and complaining regulars. The world kept spinning. By the 4th night, a Thursday, the bruising rain had washed away most of the city's grime, leaving the streets slick and reflective. The diner was quiet. Sadie was leaning against the counter, reading a battered paperback, trying to ignore the dull ache in her knees. At 1:30 a.m. the bell chimed. Sadie looked up. The book nearly slipped from her fingers. Roman Falcone stood in the doorway. This time, he was alone. No muscle, no broken-nosed sycophants. He wore a dark charcoal suit, the jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened. He looked drenched, stray droplets of rain clinging to his dark hair and the shoulders of his coat. He didn't wait to be seated. He walked straight to the counter, taking a stool directly in front of Sadie. She swallowed hard, setting her book down. "Coffee?" she asked, proud that her voice didn't waver. "Please," he said. She turned around, grabbed a mug, and filled it from the carafe. Her hands were steady. She placed it in front of him. "Cream? Sugar? Just black." He wrapped his large hands around the thick ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into his skin. He looked at her, really looked at her. It wasn't the predatory gaze of a man sizing up a target, nor the dismissive glance of a customer looking at the help. It was piercingly attentive. Sadie felt a flush creeping up her neck. She was acutely aware of the grease stain on her apron, the flyaway hairs escaping her messy bun, the sheer roundness of her face under the harsh lights. Men like him, wealthy, powerful, dangerously handsome, didn't look at women like her. If they did, it was usually a joke. "You didn't spend the money," he said suddenly. Sadie blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because you're still working the night shift in a place that smells like despair, wearing shoes that are actively destroying your arches," Roman said, taking a sip of the scalding coffee. "If you had spent it, you would have bought new shoes." Sadie crossed her arms defensively. "It felt like blood money." "It was reward money," Roman corrected softly. "You saved me a lot of trouble, Sadie. The driver, he was the leak. He had $500,000 in cash packed in the trunk. He was planning to cross the border by sunrise." Sadie felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to him?" Roman's dark eyes locked onto hers over the rim of his mug. "He was fired." The heavy implication hung in the air between them. Fired. Sadie wasn't stupid. She knew what that meant in his world. She looked away, staring at the stainless steel coffee machine. "I don't want any part of this, Whatever this is, I answered a question. That's all. I know, Roman said. He set the mug down. But you see things. You have a gift. Most people walk through life blind, drowning in their own ego. You just watch. You survive. I respect that. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the counter. The smell of rain and expensive cedar cologne drifted across the formica. Why are you here, Sadie? A woman with your intellect shouldn't be slinging hash at 2 a.m. for minimum wage. Sadie let out a bitter, tired laugh. She leaned against the back counter, mirroring his posture. Intellect doesn't pay the rent, Mr. Falcone, and the world isn't a meritocracy. When you look like me, when you don't have the right degree or the right connections, doors don't just open. You take what you can get, and you keep your head down. Roman's brow furrowed. His gaze swept over her, not with disgust or pity, but with a strange, intense validation. When you say, "When you look like me," what exactly do you mean? Sadie sighed. Don't play dumb. It doesn't suit you. I'm a chubby waitress in a dead-end job. I'm invisible. I'm part of the furniture. Roman tilted his head, his black eyes darkening. You aren't invisible to me. The words hit the air with the physical force of a dropped anvil. Sadie froze. She searched his face for the punchline, for the cruel smirk that usually followed statements like that. But Roman was entirely serious. When I walked in here 4 nights ago, Roman said, his voice dropping to a low murmur that made the hairs on Sadie's arms stand up. My men were sweating. The city is terrified of me. But you looked at me like I was an inconvenience. You looked at me like I was just another guy taking up space at your tables. You didn't shrink. You didn't cower. You stood your ground, and then you outsmarted a room full of hardened criminals without breaking a sweat. He reached out, his long fingers lightly tracing the edge of her name tag pinned to her apron. Sadie held her breath. You aren't furniture, Sadie, he said softly. You're the only real thing in this entire city. The diner bell chimed sharply, shattering the moment. 2 drunk men stumbled through the door, laughing loudly, bringing the cold reality of the night back into the room. Sadie jumped back, her face burning, breaking the magnetic pull of Roman's gravity. Roman closed his eyes for a brief second, a flash of pure irritation crossing his face. He slowly withdrew his hand and stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, his demeanor instantly snapping back to the cold, untouchable boss he was. I have to go, he said, pulling a $50 bill from his pocket and tossing it on the counter. Keep the coffee warm for me. I'll be back. Before Sadie could process what had just happened, he was gone, disappearing into the rainy night. She stood behind the counter, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, staring at the empty stool where the city's most dangerous man had just stripped away every defense she had. The new normal established itself like a slow-moving storm front. Every Tuesday and Thursday, at exactly 1:45 a.m., the black sedan parked across the street from the Starlight Diner. 10 minutes later, Roman Falcone walked through the door. He always came alone. He always sat at the counter. He always ordered his coffee black. The rest of the staff noticed. How could they not? The fry cook, a jittery guy named Kevin, started burning the hash browns whenever Roman was in the building. The manager, who usually slept in the back office, made sure the counters were spotless. The air in the diner changed when Roman was present. It felt heavier, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on Sadie's arms stand up. She tried to treat him like anyone else. She poured his coffee, slapped down his check, and complained about her aching feet. She built a fortress of sarcasm, brick by brick, hoping it would keep him at bay. It didn't work. Roman dismantled her defenses with terrifying patience. He didn't pry. He didn't ask invasive questions about her past or her family. He just listened. He remembered that she hated the smell of bleach. He noticed when she switched her shifts to avoid the weekend rush. He saw the subtle wince when she shifted her weight onto her bad heel. It infuriated her. Being seen was a vulnerability. Sadie had spent her entire adult life mastering the art of blending into the background. To Roman, she might as well have been bathed in a spotlight. The breaking point arrived on a miserable Friday night, 3 weeks after their first encounter. The diner was unusually loud. A group of local construction workers had stumbled in after a long night at a nearby dive bar. They were loud, belligerent, and smelled of stale beer and wet concrete. Sadie was exhausted, her head throbbing with the beginnings of a migraine. She was wiping down the table next to them when one of the men, a thick-necked guy with a faded anchor tattoo, reached out and grabbed her apron strings, yanking her backward. Sadie stumbled, her hip slamming into the edge of the booth. "Hey, sweetheart," the man slurred, a wet grin plastered across his face. "We ordered more fries 10 minutes ago. You moving in slow motion or what?" Sadie caught her balance, her jaw tightening. She slapped his hand away. "The fryer is backed up. You'll get them when they're done. Keep your hands to yourself." The man's grin vanished. His pride stung. He stood up, towering over her. He reached out, his heavy, calloused hand wrapping around her bicep, his grip bruising. "Listen here. You ungrateful." The word died in his throat. Sadie didn't see Roman move. 1 second, he was sitting at the counter, a ghost in a charcoal suit. The next, he was standing directly behind the construction worker. The silence that fell over the diner was absolute. Roman didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply reached out and took hold of the man's wrist. "Let her go," Roman said. His voice was barely a whisper, smooth and cold as river glass. The construction worker tried to jerk his arm away, but Roman's grip was locked like a vice. The larger man looked back, ready to swing, but the aggression drained from his face the moment he met Roman's black, flat stare. The recognition was instantaneous. The blood left the man's cheeks. Roman squeezed. A sharp, sickening pop echoed through the quiet diner. The construction worker dropped to his knees, letting out a strangled, breathless cry, cradling his now broken wrist against his chest. His friends in the booth sat perfectly still, their eyes wide with terror, refusing to intervene. Roman looked down at the man on the floor. "The meal is on the house, leave." They scrambled. The injured man was dragged to his feet by his friends, and they stumbled out the door, the bell chiming a frantic goodbye. Sadie stood frozen, rubbing her bicep. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't terrified of the violence. She lived in a rough neighborhood. She was terrified of how effortlessly Roman had executed it, and how easily he slid back into his calm demeanor. He turned to her, his dark eyes scanning her face. "Are you hurt?" The genuine concern in his voice snapped the trance. Fury, hot and sudden, bubbled up in Sadie's chest. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she hissed, grabbing her rag from the table. "You broke his wrist." "He put his hands on you," Roman stated, as if it were an immutable law of physics. Gravity makes things fall. Men who touch Sadie get broken. I can handle my own tables. Sadie threw the rag onto the counter, her voice finally rising. "I deal with guys like that twice a week. I de-escalate. I manage it. I don't need a mob boss turning my workplace into a war zone just because some drunk got handsy." Roman stood his ground, letting her anger wash over him. He didn't look defensive. "You shouldn't have to manage it, Sadie. That's the real world," she shot back, stepping into his space. She was shorter than him, but right now she felt 10 feet tall. "Maybe in your world, you just snap the bones of anyone who annoys you, but here, in reality, I still have to mop the floors. I still have to answer to a manager. You didn't do me a favor, Roman. You just marked my territory with blood. Don't ever do that again. She expected him to snap. She expected the cold, dead-eyed predator to return and remind her of her place. Instead, Roman's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, before giving a slow, deliberate nod. "Understood," he said quietly. He reached into his pocket, placed a $20 bill on the counter for his untouched coffee, and walked toward the door. He paused, his hand on the glass. "I apologize, Sadie. I overstepped." The door closed behind him. Sadie leaned heavily against the counter, closing her eyes, the adrenaline slowly leaving her system. She had just yelled at a man who commanded an empire of violence, and he had listened. The alternator finally gave out on a Tuesday. Sadie was halfway across the Washington Street Bridge, the rain coming down in a torrential, blinding sheet, when her Honda sputtered, lurched, and died. The dashboard lights flickered off. The heater died. The only sound was the aggressive drumming of rain against the windshield. She rested her forehead against the cold steering wheel. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had the time to process their emotions. Sadie just felt a deep, hollow exhaustion. She had exactly $42 in her checking account. A tow truck would cost $100. A sharp rap on her driver's side window made her flinch. She looked up. Through the rain-streaked glass, a man in a thick black overcoat stood holding a large umbrella. He tapped the glass again. It was Elias, the older man from the diner, Roman's second in command. Sadie cracked the window. Cold water sprayed against her face. "Elias!" "Ms. Sadie," Elias said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Mr. Falcone saw your car go dark. He's parked 2 cars back. He requests you join him. I've already called a tow for this vehicle. It will be taken to a reliable garage." Sadie stared at him. She looked in her rear-view mirror. The menacing silhouette of the black sedan sat idling in the rain, its headlights cutting through the downpour. She was trapped, freezing, and broke. Pride was a sweater that didn't keep you warm. She grabbed her purse, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped into the deluge. Elias sheltered her with the umbrella as they walked back to the sedan. He opened the rear door. Sadie slid into the back seat. The interior smelled of expensive leather, warm air, and cedar. Roman sat on the other side, illuminated by the faint glow of a tablet in his lap. He set it aside as she closed the door. "You have a terrible habit of being exactly where I don't want you to be," Sadie muttered, brushing wet hair out of her eyes. She was soaked, her cheap sneakers squeaking against the plush floor mats. "I prefer to call it timing," Roman replied smoothly. He reached over and pulled a thick woolen blanket from behind the passenger seat, draping it over her shivering shoulders. His knuckles brushed against her collarbone. The touch was electric, making her breath catch. He withdrew his hand immediately. "The garage will bill my office for your car. Don't argue. Consider it a retainer." Sadie wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. "A retainer for what?" Roman looked out the window at the rain-slicked city. "I have a meeting tomorrow night. A sit-down with Carlo Moretti. He runs the ports on the east side. We are negotiating a merger of certain logistical routes." "Smuggling," Sadie translated flatly. Roman's lips twitched. "Logistics. Moretti is a snake. He smiles with his teeth, but his eyes never change. He brings his top lieutenants to these meetings. I need an edge. I need someone who can look past the noise and tell me exactly what is happening in the room." Sadie stared at him. "You want me to go to a Mafia sit-down? You want a diner waitress to read a room full of killers?" "I want you," Roman corrected, turning his gaze back to her. The intensity in his black eyes made the confined space of the car feel dangerously small. "You read people better than anyone I've ever met. You see the tells. You see the fear, the confidence, the lies. I want you sitting next to me. I need your eyes, Sadie. Roman, I pour coffee. I don't navigate gang wars. $10,000, Roman said softly. The number hung in the warm air of the car. $10,000. It wasn't just rent. It was a new car. It was freedom from the crushing, suffocating weight of living paycheck to paycheck. It was a way out of the neon-lit purgatory of the night shift. Sadie swallowed hard. 10 grand, cash, to just sit there and watch. Just watch, Roman confirmed. And tell me who is lying. Sadie looked down at her hands. They were raw from the industrial dish soap at the diner. She thought about the broken alternator. She thought about the fluorescent lights. Fine, she whispered. I'll do it. Good. Roman reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a sleek black envelope. A car will pick you up at 8 tomorrow night. Everything you need is inside. Be ready. The next afternoon, a courier delivered a massive box to Sadie's cramped apartment. When she opened it, she expected some skimpy, humiliating cocktail dress, the kind of outfit men put women in when they wanted arm candy. She was wrong. Beneath the tissue paper was a heavy, dark, emerald velvet gown. It had long sleeves, a plunging but structured neckline, and an empire waist that flared perfectly over her hips. It was a dress designed not to hide a plus-sized body, but to weaponize it. It was regal. It commanded respect. Beside it lay a pair of black block-heeled shoes. Sensible, comfortable, but elegant. Roman had remembered her bad heel. Sadie ran her fingers over the velvet, a lump forming in her throat. For the first time in her life, someone hadn't looked at her and seen a problem to be fixed or covered up. Roman had looked at her and seen power. The underground club beneath the old theatre district felt like a tomb lined in gold. The air was thick with the scent of Cuban cigars, spilled bourbon, and old money. Low-hanging brass chandeliers cast a dim, amber glow over the private tables. There were no windows, no clocks, no connection to the outside world. This was a place where laws were suggestions, and the men who made them were gods. Sadie walked a half-step behind Roman, flanked by Elias and another quiet enforcer named Dante. The emerald gown fit her like a second skin, the heavy velvet swishing against the dark carpet. She felt a phantom weight on her arm, where Roman had lightly guided her down the stairs. Every eye in the room tracked them. Sadie felt the stares, the confusion, the appraisal, the cold calculation. She kept her chin up, her face an unreadable mask. She was terrified, but she refused to show it. She channeled the exhaustion of a double shift, projecting an aura of complete boredom. They reached a massive circular table in the center of the room. Sitting on the far side was Carlo Moretti. He was a sharply dressed man in his 50s, with silver hair and a perpetual reptilian grin. 3 men stood behind him, rigid and alert. "Roman!" Carlo stood up, spreading his arms wide. "My friend, it's been too long." "Carlo," Roman replied, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. He didn't shake the extended hand. He pulled out a chair for Sadie. She sat down, crossing her legs, resting her hands neatly in her lap. Roman sat beside her, leaning back. Elias and Dante took their positions. Carlo's eyes flicked to Sadie, lingering on the curve of her bust and the defiant tilt of her chin. "And who is this lovely creature? You usually prefer colder company, Roman." "She's an associate," Roman said flatly. The tone of his voice was a clear warning. "Let's get to the roots, Carlo." The meeting began. It was a masterclass in veiled threats and corporate-sounding jargon wrapped around criminal enterprise. They spoke of tonnage, shipment schedules, and customs officials on the payroll. Sadie tuned out the words. She watched the bodies. She watched Carlo. His grin was fixed, but his eyes were entirely dead. He kept drumming his index finger against his Scotch glass. Not a nervous tick, but a rhythm. She shifted her gaze to the men behind Carlo. The guy on the far left, a young kid with a neck tattoo, was sweating despite the cool temperature of the club. His hand kept dipping into his jacket pocket. The man directly behind Carlo's right shoulder was the most interesting. He was older, scarred, entirely still. But every 30 seconds, his eyes darted to the brass clock above the bar. Sadie tracked the time. 10:14 p.m., 10:15 p.m. The scarred man's jaw clenched. He subtly shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. He looked at the clock again. 10:16 p.m. He caught the eye of the sweating kid on the left. The kid gave a microscopic nod. Sadie's blood ran cold. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an ambush, and it was tied to the clock. She casually reached for the crystal water glass in front of her. As she picked it up, she intentionally clipped the edge of Roman's Scotch glass. The amber liquid spilled across the heavy mahogany table. "Apologies," Sadie murmured smoothly, leaning over as if to dab at the spill with her napkin. She pressed her shoulder against Roman's arm, putting her mouth a fraction of an inch from his ear. "The guy on the right is timing something," she whispered, her breath brushing his skin. "The kid on the left has a hand on a gun. You have less than 2 minutes before the clock hits 10:20. They aren't leaving here." Roman didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. The only sign that he had heard her was the sudden, terrifying stilling of his breathing. He slowly pulled back, picking up a napkin and tossing it over the spilled scotch. He looked at Carlo. "You know, Carlo," Roman said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a deadly resonance through the quiet room. "I've always admired your ambition, but your execution is sloppy." Carlo's smile faltered. "I don't know what you mean, Roman." "Elias," Roman said softly. Chaos erupted in a fraction of a second. Elias moved with a speed that defied his age. He drew a suppressed pistol from beneath his coat and fired twice. The dull thwip-thwip barely registered over the ambient noise of the club. The young kid on the left dropped instantly, a red bloom expanding on his shoulder, his hand still trapped in his pocket. Dante lunged across the table, grabbing the scarred man by his tie and slamming his face into the mahogany with a sickening crunch. Roman grabbed Sadie's waist. His grip was bruising, pulling her out of her chair and behind his solid frame. He drew his own weapon, aiming it squarely between Carlo Moretti's eyes. Carlo was frozen, his hands raised, his face pale with shock. The club around them erupted into shouts, patrons scrambling for the exits, tables overturning. "The roots are mine, Carlo," Roman said, his voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. "And if you ever look at a clock in my presence again, I will remove your eyes. Do we have an understanding?" Carlo swallowed hard, nodding frantically. "Good." Roman didn't look away from Carlo. "Elias, Dante, we're leaving." Roman kept his arm locked around Sadie's waist, dragging her backward toward the private exit. They moved flawlessly, a violent, orchestrated retreat. They hit the cold night air of the alleyway, the steel door slamming shut behind them. The black sedan was waiting, engine roaring. Roman shoved Sadie into the back seat, sliding in right behind her. "Drive!" he barked. Elias hit the gas, the tires screaming against the asphalt as they tore out of the alley. Sadie was pressed against the leather door panel, her chest heaving, gasping for air. Her hands were shaking violently. The adrenaline was a tidal wave, crashing over her, leaving her dizzy and nauseous. Roman sat next to her, chest rising and falling heavily. He holstered his weapon. The dome light of the street lamps flashed across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the feral intensity in his eyes. He looked at her. Sadie looked back. She expected to feel horror. She had just witnessed men being gunned down. She was trapped in a car with a murderer. But as Roman's dark eyes locked onto hers, the fear evaporated, replaced by something much more dangerous. It was an undeniable, terrifying heat. She hadn't just survived his world, she had navigated it. She had saved him. Roman reached out. His hand was slightly unsteady. He cupped her jaw, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. His touch was burning hot. 10:20, he murmured, his voice thick, rough with the aftermath of violence. A hit squad was waiting at the service elevator at exactly 10:20. He leaned in, the space between them vanishing. He smelled of cordite, rain, and raw power. "You didn't just read the room, Sadie," Roman whispered, his lips mere inches from hers. "You own it." The drive was a blur of neon streaks against rain-slicked glass. Sadie didn't speak. She couldn't. The violent tremor in her hands had migrated to her chest, making every breath feel jagged and shallow. The black sedan didn't take her back to her cramped apartment. It descended into a secure underground garage beneath a towering glass structure in the financial district. When the car stopped, Elias didn't open the door. He sat in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, giving them absolute privacy. Roman finally broke the silence. He shifted, his broad shoulders blocking out the harsh fluorescent parking lights. "Are you injured?" "No," Sadie rasped. Her throat felt coated in ash. "No, I'm just processing. Take your time." She looked at him. His tie was discarded. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the faint shadow of a dark tattoo on his collarbone. He didn't look like a man who had just put a gun to a rival's head. He looked like a man who had just finished a long day at the office. That terrified her more than the gunfire. "You didn't flinch," Roman observed quietly. "I grew up in the South End," Sadie said, forcing a bitter smile. "Gunfire just meant you turned up the TV, but seeing it up close, seeing a man drop, that's different." "I told you it was a dangerous room." "You told me it was a negotiation," Sadie snapped, the anger finally piercing through the shock. "You put me in the crossfire. If I hadn't seen that guy watching the clock—" "You would be dead," Roman finished for her, his voice devoid of pity. "And so would I. But I knew you would see it. I staked my life on it. You think I brought you there as a prop? I brought you because you are a weapon, Sadie." He reached beside him, picking up a heavy leather duffel bag. He unzipped it and pulled out 2 thick, banded stacks of $100 bills. He dropped them onto her lap. They landed with a heavy, muted thud against the velvet gown. 10,000, Roman said. "As promised, plus a bonus for saving my life." Sadie stared at the money. It was more cash than she had ever seen in one place. It was the solution to every mundane, soul-crushing problem she had. It was a new alternator, a new apartment, new shoes, but it felt like an anchor. She picked up the stacks and held them out to him. "I don't want it." Roman's brow furrowed. It was the first time she had ever seen him genuinely confused. "Don't be a martyr, Sadie. You earned it." "I don't want to be an employee, Roman," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She didn't know where the courage was coming from. Maybe the adrenaline, maybe the velvet dress. "I pour coffee for tips. I survive. Tonight I lived. I don't want a paycheck to go back to the diner and pretend this never happened." Roman didn't take the money. He leaned closer. The heat radiating off his body was immense. His dark eyes searched hers, stripping away the layers of cynicism and exhaustion she wore like armor. "If you don't take the money, and you don't go back to the diner," Roman murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips. "What exactly are you asking me for, Sadie?" "I don't know," she breathed. He didn't give her time to figure it out. Roman reached out, wrapping his large hand around the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in the hair she had carefully pinned up, pulling the pins loose until the heavy strands fell around her shoulders. He pulled her forward. His kiss wasn't gentle. It was desperate, bruising, and completely consuming. Sadie dropped the money. Her hands found the lapels of his jacket, gripping the expensive wool as if he were a life raft. He tasted like expensive scotch and violence. She kissed him back with all the pent-up frustration of a woman who had spent her life being invisible. She poured every double shift, every aching muscle, every ounce of overlooked intelligence into the kiss. Roman groaned, pulling her across the leather seat until she was practically in his lap, the heavy velvet of her gown tangling with his suit. His thumb traced her jaw, his other hand gripping her waist with possessive, terrifying strength. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing hard. "You don't belong in that diner," Roman whispered fiercely, resting his forehead against hers. "But my world is blood and concrete. If you step into it, there is no stepping out." "I've always walked on concrete," Sadie replied, her voice steady. "I just want better shoes." A low, genuine laugh rumbled in Roman's chest. He kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender it felt entirely out of place in the back of a getaway car. "Go home, Sadie," he said softly. "Take the weekend. Sleep. I will come for you on Monday. We'll figure out the rest." Monday came, but Sadie didn't wait at her apartment. Routine was a drug. It grounded her. She had spent 28 years building a life of predictable miseries, and breaking out of it felt like stepping into a void. So she put on her hideous polyester uniform, tied her apron strings tight around her waist, and clocked in for the midnight shift at the Starlight Diner. It was a test. She needed to know if she could still exist in this world. By 2:30 a.m., she had her answer. The fluorescent lights gave her a migraine. The smell of stale grease made her nauseous. The velvet gown hanging in her closet felt like a dream. The sticky formica counter was her reality. The diner was empty. Outside, the city was drowning in a torrential downpour. The cook, Kevin, had gone into the back alley for a smoke break, leaving Sadie alone to clean the coffee machines. The bell above the door chimed. Sadie didn't look up immediately. "Take any booth," she mumbled, wiping down the steel carafe. "Coffee's fresh." "We're not here for coffee." The voice was unfamiliar, rough, grating, laced with an aggressive edge. Sadie slowly raised her head. Two men stood by the entrance. They weren't truckers. They weren't drunks. They wore cheap, waterlogged leather jackets and jeans. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, reached back and flipped the lock on the diner door. He pulled the blinds down with a sharp yank. Sadie's blood turned to ice. She recognized the scarred man. He was the one standing behind Carlo at the club, the one who had watched the clock. Dante had smashed his face into a table, and the evidence was clear. His nose was heavily bandaged, his left eye swollen shut. "You," the scarred man spat, walking slowly toward the counter. The other man flanked him, drawing a heavy revolver from his waistband. "You're Falcone's little whispering bird." Sadie took a slow step back. Her mind raced. Kevin was outside, the back door locked from the inside. She was trapped behind a narrow counter with nowhere to run. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sadie said, her voice remarkably calm. "Shut up," the scarred man hissed. He stopped right at the counter. "Carlo is bleeding money because of what Falcone did. But we know he has a soft spot for you. We saw the way he looked at you. We grab you, we squeeze Falcone. Simple math." "Roman Falcone doesn't care about a waitress," Sadie lied smoothly. She slowly reached behind her, her fingers brushing the handle of the industrial coffee pot. It was full. It was boiling. "Then he won't care if I put a hole in your kneecap," the man with the gun sneered, raising the barrel. Sadie didn't wait. She grabbed the glass pot of boiling coffee and hurled the contents straight into the scarred man's face. He shrieked, a horrible wet sound of pure agony, clawing at his blistered skin and stumbling backward into the booths. The man with the gun flinched, firing a wild shot. The bullet shattered the pie case, sending shards of glass and cherry filling exploding across the counter. Sadie dropped to the floor, her knees slamming into the hard linoleum. She scrambled on all fours down the length of the counter. The gunman fired again, the bullet ripping through the aluminum napkin dispensers directly above her head. "Get her!" the scarred man screamed, still blindly wiping at his ruined face. Sadie reached the end of the counter. She grabbed the yellow mop bucket that Kevin had left out. It was filled with dirty, soapy water. She shoved it hard into the aisle just as the gunman came rounding the corner. He tripped over the bucket. His boots hit the slick, soapy water on the linoleum, and his legs flew out from under him. He hit the floor with a bone-rattling thud, his gun sliding across the tiles. Sadie didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy metal spatula from the grill station, vaulted over the fallen man, and sprinted for the kitchen doors. She hit the swinging doors full force, barricading herself in the narrow prep area. She dragged the heavy stainless steel prep table across the entrance, jamming it under the door handles. Outside, the gunman scrambled to his feet, cursing violently. He threw his weight against the swinging doors, but the prep table held. "I'm gonna kill you," he roared, slamming his shoulder into the wood. The doors shuddered. Sadie backed away, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the rack. Her chest heaved. She was trapped. There were no exits in the prep room. She gripped the handle of the skillet with both hands, raising it like a baseball bat. If he came through that door, she was going to swing for his skull. Bam! The gunman hit the door again. Wood splintered. Bam! Another hit. The metal prep table groaned, scraping back an inch across the tile. Suddenly, the diner bell rang out. Not a chime. It was the sound of the entire glass front door shattering inward. The slamming against the kitchen door stopped instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the diner. Sadie held her breath, her fingers white-knuckling the skillet. "Where is she?" The voice was a low, demonic rumble. It didn't sound human. It sounded like pure, unadulterated violence. It was Roman. "Falcone!" the scarred man yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Drop the—" Two suppressed gunshots cut through the air. Thwip, thwip. The sound of heavy bodies hitting the floor followed a second later. Then footsteps. Heavy, rapid footsteps marching toward the kitchen. "Sadie." Roman's voice was tight, frantic. He hit the swinging doors, pushing against the barricade. "Sadie, it's me. Open the door." Sadie dropped the skillet. It hit the floor with a deafening clang. She pushed the metal prep table aside, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the edges. The doors swung open. Roman stood there. His suit was drenched in rain. He held a sleek black pistol in his right hand. He looked past her, scanning the tiny kitchen for threats, before his black eyes locked onto hers. He dropped the gun. It clattered against the tile. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing her by the shoulders and pulling her roughly against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, his breathing ragged and uneven. "I'm okay," Sadie whispered, her hands resting flat against his chest. She could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. It was beating as fast as hers. "I was 10 minutes late," Roman breathed, his voice raw. "I went to your apartment. You weren't there. I came here, and I saw the glass." He pulled back, gripping her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. He inspected her for bullet holes, for blood. All he found was a smear of grease on her forehead. He looked past her, seeing the shattered pie case, the soapy water, the boiling coffee pot on the floor. He looked back at her, a mixture of awe and absolute terror in his eyes. "You fought them off." "I told you." Sadie managed a weak, watery smile. "I can handle my tables." 10 minutes later, the diner was entirely locked down. Elias and Dante were outside in the rain, dragging two heavy, tarp-wrapped bundles into the back of a panel van. Inside, the neon lights flickered over a war zone. Glass coated the floor like ice. The smell of burnt coffee and gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Sadie sat in the red vinyl booth, the same booth where Roman had first tested her. She was wrapped in Roman's dry wool coat. She stared blankly at a shattered sugar dispenser on the table. Roman sat across from her. He was completely still, his hands folded on the table. The frantic energy had bled out of him, replaced by a cold, devastating resolve. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He slid it across the table. It stopped in front of her hands. "There are new passports in there," Roman said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A bank account routed through Switzerland with $5 million. A deed to a property in the south of France. It's quiet. It's safe. Elias has a private plane waiting at the airstrip." Sadie looked at the envelope, then slowly raised her eyes to meet his. "What is this?" "An apology," Roman said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the shattered pie case. "I was arrogant. I thought I could bring you into my life and control the blast radius. Tonight proved I can't. Carlo's men didn't come for me. They came for you because they knew you mattered to me. I made you a target. So you're sending me away?" "I am keeping you alive," Roman corrected sharply, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were entirely black, a void of suppressed agony. "You survived tonight because you are brilliant. But luck runs out, Sadie. If you stay in this city, if you stay near me, one day you will walk out of your apartment, and a man will put a bullet in your head just to watch me bleed." He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He looked like a king resigning his throne. "The plane leaves in an hour. Don't pack. Just go." He turned his back on her, walking toward the shattered front door. "Roman." He stopped, but he didn't turn around. Sadie stood up. The heavy wool coat slipped off her shoulders, pooling on the red vinyl seat. She walked around the table, the soles of her cheap shoes crunching on the broken glass. She stopped directly behind him. "When you came in here that first night," Sadie said, her voice steady and clear in the ruined diner, "you asked me a question. You tested me. You wanted to know if I was smart enough to see the truth." Roman closed his eyes, his broad back tense. "Now I have a question for you," Sadie said. "And if you answer it honestly, I'll take the envelope. I'll get on the plane. You'll never see me again." Roman turned slowly. He looked down at her. He was a man who commanded an empire, a man who broke bones with a whisper. But right now, looking at the chubby waitress in a stained uniform, he looked completely defenseless. "Ask," he said. Sadie stepped into his space. She didn't shrink. She didn't cower. She looked up into his pitch-black eyes. "Do you want me to go?" Silence. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The rain lashed against the broken windows. Roman stared at her. He looked at the stubborn set of her jaw. He looked at the intelligence blazing in her eyes. She wasn't asking for permission. She was demanding the truth. "No," Roman whispered, his voice shattering in the quiet room. "I want you to stay. I want you standing next to me. I want you to run this city with me. But I cannot watch you die, Sadie." Sadie reached up, grabbing the lapels of his jacket, exactly as she had done in the car. She pulled him down, forcing him to look at her on her level. "Then teach me how not to," she said fiercely. "You said I was a weapon. Then sharpen me, Roman. Don't put me in a glass case in France. Let me be exactly who you saw that first night." Roman's breath caught. The cold, dead-eyed predator vanished completely. He looked at her not as a liability, not as a civilian to be protected, but as an absolute equal. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her entirely off the floor of the ruined diner. He kissed her, and this time there was no desperation. There was only a terrifying, immovable certainty. When he set her down, she was smiling. A real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "My shift ends in 5 minutes," Sadie said, stepping back and untying her apron. She let it drop to the floor, right on top of the shattered glass. "But I think I'm going to clock out early." Roman reached out, taking her hand. His grip was warm and unbreakable. "Let's go home, Sadie." They walked out of the diner together, stepping over the threshold and into the pouring rain. The black sedan was waiting. Elias held the door open, giving Sadie a single, respectful nod. She didn't look back at the Starlight Diner. She didn't have to. She was never pouring another cup of coffee again. When a woman who has spent her life being invisible finally steps into the light, the whole world has to adjust its vision. Sadie didn't just survive the darkest corners of the city. She walked in, rewrote the rules, and claimed the king. If you loved this journey from the graveyard shift to the penthouse, and if you believe real power comes from the mind, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder to never underestimate the quiet ones. Subscribe and ring the bell for more intense, grounded storytelling. See you in the comments.
This is acrylic marker. Okay, dear. Oh, thanks, Dreamer. Yeah, that one was fun. Yeah. I love I'm okay. Yeah, I feel like you'd be really good with that. I've been enjoying them. It was a challenge certainly when I started, but I'm getting used to them. Show us tits and boobies. All right. All right then, go on. Don't mind if I do. Let's see. Oh my god. Fuck. These are so sick. Hang on. Oh my god. Okay, wait. Holy shit, dude. I want to show you what Heinz was working on. Love to try those markers. Don't want to commit. Yeah. You know what's nice though, Dreamer, is these are not crazy expensive. I got a